and out of view, but Shaw just ducked his head and ran. He felt the zombies clutching at him, pulling at him. But all of that was somehow secondary, a world away. All that mattered was getting his son somewhere safe and warm, providing for him, caring for him. They entered the apartment's central hallway and were immediately thrown into darkness. He saw dim shapes midway down the hall, bumbling into each other as they attempted to mount the stairs, and he could hear the ones from outside splashing around behind him. He looked left, looked right, and saw a closed door a few feet down the hall. Shaw set Anthony down next to the door and rammed it with his shoulder. It gave way on his second attempt, and he found himself inside the open doorway, looking at a decomposing corpse face up on a mattress. He stared at it for a second, breathing hard. The skin on the corpse's face had turned black with rot, the chest and stomach bloated with the gases that accompany decomposition. Its hands were gnarled claws, and the tightening action of rigor had pulled them up in front of the chest in a posture that suggested the corpse was frozen while trying to push away some great weight. Shaw let out a long, hissing breath of disgust. "So this is it," he thought. "Last stand down here with the dead. And the dying. Okay, then. So be it." He threw the duffel bags on top of the TV set at the foot of the bed, and then stepped back into the hallway, grabbed Anthony and pulled him inside the room, leaning him up against the wall. He closed the door and braced it with a dresser. Then he crossed to the bed, and with one quick motion dumped the mattress and the decaying corpse into the water, propping the mattress up so that it sandwiched the corpse against the wall. "No point in Anthony having to see that," he thought. "Can you help me with this?" Shaw asked, getting into position to push the bed against the door. He looked at his son. Anthony's face had turned so pale the blood vessels showed through the skin. His eyes were rimmed and red, his mouth hanging open. Anthony stared back at him, his expression a ghastly mixture of terror and blank incomprehension. "It's okay, son. Just stand there." He reached into the pouch he kept at his left hip and counted 6 more full magazines. "Damn it," he thought, "not nearly enough." But when he looked up at Anthony, his smile was steady. "Don't you worry, son. Daddy's going to take care of you." Chapter 21. Eleanor backed away from the door. The zombies were banging on the other side, causing it to shake in the frame. Panicking, she looked around once again for something she could use as cover. But there was nothing. "Get a grip, girl," she told herself. "Slow down. Focus. Think this through." "No," she said aloud. "No, I can't." "You can. You will. You have to, Eleanor. Get a grip." The gun was a known quantity, something she could control. In the academy, her tactics instructors had taught her to slow down, analyze the situation. When things get out of hand, you get control of one thing, really focus, and everything else will start to fall in line. Eleanor did that now. She ejected the M16's magazine and counted 11 rounds. She had those and one in the chamber, and another full magazine in the back pocket of her jeans. But that was it. After that she'd be reduced to using the rifle as a club. How could she have made it through so much, she wondered, only to be reduced to this? It wasn't fair. She had fought a better fight than this. Hadn't she done everything a woman could possibly be expected to do? The door shook with another hard hit, and this time something cracked. The wood was giving way. As she watched, a crack raced from just below the doorknob over to the bottom hinge. How many hands were pounding on that door, she wondered. 12? 14? More than that? It sounded as if the stairs beyond were full of the infected. And then the door gave way. It snapped off its hinges and fell from the doorframe in 2 large pieces. And in the darkness beyond, Eleanor could see the faces of the damned. For a moment they stared at her, and her at them, and then they surged forward, a wave of teeth and fingernails. She raised her rifle. The ghost ring sight centered on the lead zombie's chest. And then she lowered it. Inspiration struck. She stepped over the low wall of the air-conditioning platform and onto the steeply sloping roof. There was an uncertain moment, a deliciously acrophobic moment as her stomach rolled over and she felt as if she might faint. And then she closed her eyes and forced herself to regain control. Then she opened her eyes and started crab-walking across the roof, the shingles rough as sandpaper between her fingers. She moved toward the north corner of the building, passing beneath the air-conditioning platform, and chanced to look up. One of the zombies was lunging toward her. It went over the knee-high wall and tumbled forward, down the side of the roof and over the edge. She watched it fall, arms and legs pinwheeling wildly in the air, and she let out a cry that was part terrified whimper, part triumphant yell. Breathing hard, she looked back up at the air-conditioning platform. More zombies were coming over the knee-high wall around the platform. Several of them lost their balance and went over the side of the roof. But others stayed on their feet and started toward her. Moving in a crouch, Eleanor backed away. She had maybe 30 feet left of roof behind her, but she could already tell she was going to have to stand and fight. More and more of the zombies were making their way down the length of the roof. She raised her rifle and fired at a female up near the roof peak. The zombie collapsed and rolled down the side, taking 6 others with it. "Yeah!" she screamed, shaking her rifle at the remaining zombies. "This is going to work," she thought. "It is really going to work." But there were still others she couldn't just bowl off the side. A fat blond man in a blue T-shirt was closing on her. His jeans were soaked with blood, and with every shuffling step across the shingled roof, his tattered sneakers left dark smears of ichor. She stepped over the ridge and grabbed her gun by the barrel, holding it like a baseball bat. She waited for him to step into range, and when he was close enough, she swung for his head. The blow knocked him down, but he grabbed for her at the same time, and the M16 shoulder strap got caught up in his fingers. The next instant, Eleanor was struggling to maintain her balance. The zombie was sliding down the roof sheeting, but it was pulling her with it, and try as she might, she just couldn't keep her feet. Eleanor pitched over forward, landed on her chin, and slid down the side of the roof. She saw the edge racing toward her, the yawning emptiness beyond it coming rapidly into view, and she clawed at the shingles for something to hold on to. The next instant the zombie was tumbling over the side and falling free to the writhing carpet of clutching hands and upturned faces below. Eleanor followed after it, swinging her legs over the edge and catching herself on the eaves at the last possible instant. She had only seen the ground below for a second, but that had been more than enough for her. There were hundreds of zombies crowded in together down there. An infected bolus of hands and teeth and gore reaching up for her, their collective motion almost tidal. Eleanor was delirious with panic. Her fingers were digging into the tar-strip shingles, but it wasn't enough. She was slipping, inch by inch. Her legs pumped and kicked at the empty air. Her backpack and the M16 seemed to weigh a ton. She would have jettisoned them if she'd had a free hand, but that couldn't happen now. Her grip gave for just a second, and she slid 4 or 5 inches farther down, leaving only her nose and chin above the level of the roof. A scream rose in her throat. Above her, coming down the slope of the roof in a lurching, out-of-control trot, was another zombie. This one was unable to control its descent, and toppled over the edge, his fingers grazing the sleeve of her blouse as he went over top of her. But the others behind her were moving more slowly, and even in her panicked state, a part of her mind told her that at least one of those zombies would have enough control to attack her hands. Then she caught a sound rising above all the others. It was a scream. A young girl shrieking for help. "Medicine!" Eleanor yelled back. "Medicine!" In her mind, Eleanor was absolutely certain that the sound was coming from her daughter, the way a mother will know the cry of her own hurt child above the din of dozens of others on a crowded playground. Madison was down there somewhere. Alive. Alive, but in trouble. Eleanor kicked at the side of the building, praying for a ledge, a windowsill, anything she could use. What she found was a metal pipe. The toe of her sneaker raked across it. Frantic, she groped for it with her foot, trying to get a feel for where it was, and felt it curve upward, hugging the underside of the eaves. 2 more zombies sailed over top of her. She chanced to look down and saw them splash into the water, the zombie horde seeming to swallow them up whole. "Oh, Jesus," she thought. "Oh, sweet Jesus, please make this work." Aware that she only had one chance to get this right, she reached under the eaves with her right hand and gripped the top of the pipe. "Please," she said. "Oh, please." She let go of the roof and slid off the side, screaming as her weight dropped and her fingers nearly let go. But her grip did hold. Eleanor fell forward, smacking face first into the wall. She brought her left hand up, slapping wildly at the pipe, and got her fingers around it. She pumped her feet against the wall until she got traction there, and then was still. Her heart was pounding in her chest. A white-hot pain shot up from her fingers to her shoulders, but she didn't care. She was deliriously happy just to be alive, and she threw her head back and let out a yell that gave way first to laughter, and then to tears. Eleanor looked down and saw a window just below her left shoe. She could make it, she thought, as long as the pipe would continue to bear her weight. Working slowly, careful to keep as much weight as possible on her feet, she started to slide down. When she reached the bottom ledge of the window, she glanced inside. The floor was a patchwork of puddles, dotted by glass blown in during the recent storms. Sodden furniture had turned gray from mildew. The front door had been knocked in, by zombies, she guessed, going room to room looking for food. But there were no zombies in there now, and that was all that counted. She climbed in through the window and sat down heavily on the ledge, exhausted down to the bone. But she couldn't rest, and she knew it. Madison was out there. She couldn't hear her screams any more, but she knew in her heart that her daughter was out there somewhere, and that Madison needed her. That was all it took for Eleanor. The muscles in her arms and back ached. Standing up took a sheer act of will, but stand she did. Eleanor turned and leaned out the window and looked down. A blur of faces stared back up at her. She felt suddenly sick, light-headed and utterly empty of ideas. How was she going to get over there? And for that matter, what was she going to do if she did get over there? There were thousands of zombies down there, and all she had was a handful of bullets. But she had to try. From somewhere below she heard a man's voice, yelling in defiant rage. The sound was followed by the chainsaw clatter of machine-gun fire. Mark Shaw, she thought. The fucking bastard's still alive, still fighting. She nearly spit on the floor in disgust. But then she stopped and thought about Captain Shaw. Still alive. Still fighting. He would fight, wouldn't he? To the very end. That was the kind of man he was. Maybe she could use that. She leaned back out the window and looked down. There was a cinder-block wall down there that connected her building with the building from which she had heard Madison's screams. She could run across that. Maybe. And maybe Captain Shaw could help her with the zombies. She started to scream at the crowd. She yelled at the top of her lungs, waving at them, picking up trash from the floor and throwing it out the window at them. "Up here, you fucking bastards! Come on! Come and get me!" Her voice stirred them up, exactly as she hoped it would. Their moans rose from a dull roar to a maddened frenzy. "That's it!" she screamed, slapping the outside wall below her window. "That's it! Come on up! You want me? Come and take me!" The crowd surged against the ground floor. They were pouring in through windows and circling around to the front of the building to enter the doorway there. But she could hear them out in the hallway, too. The ones from the roof would be coming down. Probably already were. She was pretty sure she could hear them banging around out there on the stairs, searching for her. And then she heard gunfire again. Coming hard, coming fast. "That's it, Shaw," she muttered. "Chew 'em up." She didn't give herself a chance to think about what came next. There was no way she could have, and still have had the nerve to go forward. She climbed out the window, one hand on the metal pipe, and swung herself out. Then she started down the pipe, blocking out the ravenous moaning below as best she could, thinking only of Madison. As she went lower, the sound of shooting grew louder. Shaw was, exactly as she expected, putting up one hell of a good fight. And it was driving the zombies into a frenzy. They were pouring into the building now. "Come on," she said quietly, watching them. "Keep coming." She dropped onto the wall and teetered there, her arms outstretched for balance. Zombies reached up for her, slapping the wall with their bloody palms, trying in vain to climb the slime-slick walls. She swallowed once, and then turned all her focus on walking the wall. "One foot after the other," she thought. "One step at a time." She made it halfway across before one of the zombies managed to get a hand on her shoe. Eleanor wasn't sure how it had happened, whether it had jumped or simply scaled over the backs of the others, but the end result was the same. Its mangled hand clamped down over the toe of her sneaker and didn't let go. As the zombie tumbled back down into the water below, Eleanor pitched over. The pack shifted on her back. The M16 slipped off her shoulder, and she reached for it clumsily, barely regaining control of the weapon in time to prevent one of the zombies from grabbing it. She was on her knees now, struggling to get back up. Faces swam below her, indistinct and hostile. The noise was tremendous, but she had her balance back, at least for the time being. Would it help? She wondered. The tendons in her ankles felt limp as wet spaghetti. Her legs were burning. Eleanor rose slowly, painfully to her feet, straightened the pack and the weapon, and started walking again. She rushed her final steps and actually lunged for the wall, catching the metal pipe that ran up the side of the building as if it was base in a game of tag. And maybe, she thought, in a way, it kind of was. She had made it across the courtyard. She was close now. Very close. The window to her right led into a second-story efficiency apartment. Eleanor had to kick in the window to get inside, and once she did, she ran to the door and listened to the hallway outside. With so many voices moaning, screaming, it was hard to focus on exactly where they were coming from. Behind her, below her, above? She couldn't tell. Eleanor took a chance and opened the door a crack. The hallway beyond was dark. She listened and couldn't make out any footsteps. If this building was anything like the one she just left, and she didn't see why it wouldn't be, from the outside they appeared to be twins, there would be staircases at the front of the building and another in the back. She went out into the hallway and crossed to the stairs. Looking down into the gloom below, she could see zombies pushing against each other, trying to make their way back to the back of the building. At the same time, she heard Madison screaming. She was very close. "Madison!" she gasped. Down below, several pairs of eyes turned toward her. They started up the stairs, a renewed hunger in their moaning, and soon A dozen or more were coming for her. "Oh, shit," she said, backing up. She looked up. The stairwell twined up 4 stories, just like in the other building. There was room to retreat. But when she looked back down the stairs, she realized that the number of her pursuers had grown. From an original dozen or so, a swarm had formed. They were pushing against each other, some falling onto their faces as the stronger ones behind them clambered over their backs in their rush to overtake her. "That's it!" she screamed at them. "Come on up, you bastards! Come and get me!" She backed up the stairs, careful to keep just a few steps ahead of the lead zombie, calling out to them the whole time. "Don't stop!" she yelled. "Come on!" When she reached the 3rd-floor landing, she broke away from the stairs and sprinted down the central hallway to the back of the building. Here she had to be quick. She brought her M16 up and worked her way quickly down the stairs, scanning every corner to make sure she wasn't stepping into a crowd of them. She passed a dead and mostly eaten body on the 2nd-floor landing, but no zombies, and she was thankful for that. But then she jumped into the water at the ground floor and turned the corner. And there, less than 10 feet in front of her, was Jim, hanging from the ceiling, and Madison on his back. Eleanor couldn't believe it. He had his hands on one wall, his feet against the opposite wall, his body like an arch over the floor, and below him a swarm of zombies groped the air and tugged at his shirt. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice just a notch above a whisper. The zombies turned toward her. One by one their hands dropped from the air, and they came for her. Eleanor felt something click inside her. Some important part of her was coming into focus, and everything seemed to slow down. She saw every face in that zombie crowd, and as she raised her rifle and started firing, she felt utterly calm and completely in control. The zombies went down one by one, and when the last empty cartridge shell flew from the weapon's breech, the water was choked with bodies. Nothing moved but the water. It lapped against the walls and rocked the dead bodies gently. They were alone now. Eleanor looked up at her husband, at the ashen, sweat-soaked expression on his face, and said, "Jim?" He dropped from the ceiling then. He and Madison landed in the water with a dull splash. Madison let out a startled cry that was silenced by the water. Eleanor ran forward and scooped her up and squeezed her so hard Madison began to choke. "Mom!" she gasped. "Oh, baby," Eleanor said. "Oh, my sweet baby." She held Madison at arm's length then, barely believing that she was holding her again. Madison's dirty face was lined by tear tracks. The whites of her eyes stood out with startling clarity. "Mom, I was so scared." "I know, baby. Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" Madison could only shake her head no, and then she started to cry. Eleanor pulled her close and hugged her, and thought there was no way under the sun she was going to let that little girl go again, until her gaze met Jim's. Eleanor had seen exhaustion before. She'd seen it as a girl in the faces of the rescue workers during Hurricanes Rita and Ike. She'd seen it in the faces of her fellow cops after the Westheimer riots 5 years ago, and she had seen it in the eyes of the refugees who waited up on the Beltway for their turn to go through the military's checkpoint. But she had never seen exhaustion like she did in her husband's eyes. The man had been pushed to his very limits, and yet he continued to hold on. She could only imagine what it must have been like, supporting himself and Madison both up on the walls. How long had he been like that? 25 or 30 minutes? "Oh, Jim," she said, and she let Madison go and reached for him. He staggered forward and collapsed against her. She took his weight by throwing her arms around him. "Jim, you did it. I can't believe it. You saved our daughter. Thank you. He grunted, but didn't embrace her. She backed away slightly and looked at him. Jim? The muscles in his upper arms felt hard as concrete. Jim, are you okay? I can't feel my arms, he said. She laughed at that, laughed hard, and when at long last she got it under control, she threw her arms around his neck and kissed his cheek. Come on, she said, looking first at Jim, then at Madison. Let's get out of here. Chapter 22. The door caved inward. Mark Shaw's gaze snapped toward it, M16 at the ready. Hands were reaching through the narrow gap, pressing on the door, shaking it. The zombies had managed to open it maybe 3 inches, but the bed frame and the dresser were holding, for now, and Shaw lowered his weapon. Anthony was still standing in the same place, swaying drunkenly, a soul-sick look in his eyes. Shaw took the pistol from Anthony's hand and walked around the bed frame so he could see out the gap. A zombie was trying to jam his face through the opening, the lips pulled back in a grin of bloody teeth, and right before Shaw shot him in the face, he had a flash of Jack Nicholson in The Shining, jamming his head through the door he'd just hacked with a hatchet, taunting Shelley Duvall with an insanely shrill, "Here's Johnny!" Shaw's first shot killed the zombie, but there were too many bodies pressing up against it from behind, and though the corpse sagged downward, it didn't fall. Shaw had just enough room to see over the dead zombie. Working slowly, taking each shot in its turn, he emptied the remainder of the magazine into the crowd. Let the corpses pile up, he thought. The fuckers will have to climb their way over. Maybe it'll slow them up a little. When the gun was empty, he tossed it aside. There was no point in holding on to a weapon that didn't have any bullets. And it wasn't like they were going to get out of this alive. Shaw realized with an eerie calm that he'd already resigned himself to that fate. The only question was how long he could hold out. But that wasn't the only question, was it? There was Anthony to think about, too. Shaw licked his dry and cracked lips, then looked at his youngest son, his wonderfully gifted child. Anthony was doing badly. Besides a distinctly circular swaying, he was pale, so very pale. His lips had lost their color. His eyes were red-rimmed, and they had a glazed, unfocused look, as if he were high on dope and close to passing out. Beads of sweat rolled down his cheeks. Shaw thought, "What about you, son? When the time comes, will I be able to do it for you, like I did for Brent?" But with the same mental breath, he answered his own question. "Yes, you will. You'll have to. There is a duty to perform, and you will do it, just like you've always done, just like you tried to teach to your sons. Maybe Anthony won't understand why you have to do it. Maybe he'll spend his last few lucid moments pleading for you to save his life instead of taking it. For as gifted as he was, Anthony was never the one to make the hard decisions. He never understood that mercy could be savage, or that sometimes a father's love could hurt. He never understood. The zombies continued to pound on the door. Shaw could hear the wood snapping. It wouldn't be long now. 2 or 3 minutes at the most. Soon there would be some hard fighting, some Davy Crockett at the Alamo hard fighting. Shaw let his gaze slide from the door back to Anthony. "I'm sorry," he said. Anthony's milky eyes turned on Shaw's, and then seemed to slip out of focus again. "I could have handled this better, I know," Shaw said. "You trusted me to do the right thing, and I thought I was doing the right thing. But sometimes it's hard, you know. It's hard to always know what the right thing is. When you're a dad, you just kind of go with your gut most of the time and hope that dumb luck will see you through it. Most of the time it does. And when it does, it feels so good. But Shaw trailed off. He was rambling, not making any sense, and he knew it. Anthony was just staring off into space, as if he was empty inside. None of this was getting through. "You're talking to yourself," Shaw thought. "Yeah, maybe," he muttered. He fingered the edge of the dresser, his mind turning back over the years. "You don't remember this," he said to Anthony, "but when you and Brent were kids, you had this bedroom furniture set that your mom insisted we get for you." "They're growing boys," she said. "They need real furniture." He laughed to himself. "I'll still remember it. The Easton collection, in honey pine. Easton, like the baseball bat, you know. I was a detective at the time, making shit for a paycheck, and that furniture cost a ton of money. But your mom said you guys had to have it, and she begged me to buy it. What could I do? I mean, it was for my boys, you know. Only the best. I'd do anything for you guys." He looked at Anthony, but there was nothing there. The boy had no time left. He'd probably go before the door did. Shaw sighed. "I worked God knows how many hours of overtime to get the money to pay for that furniture. I must have done a dozen 20-hour shifts, maybe more than that, but I did it. We got the money, and I bought you guys the furniture. Of course, the first thing you did was color it with crayons. I remember you threw Brent into the bedside table about a month after I bought it and broke the lamp. God, you guys were horrible to each other. But it didn't matter, you know. All the work, all the extra hours. It didn't even matter that you wrote all over it. I'd never been so proud in my life, just knowing that I had provided for you, that I had done my job as your dad. There's a power in that feeling that makes it all worth it. That's what I wanted to do here, with this money. I wanted that feeling all over again. I wanted to know that I had provided for you." Anthony stirred then. Shaw looked at him hopefully. "Anthony, do you understand that? You don't hate me, do you? I promise you I didn't want this to happen." "Can I see the money?" Anthony said. His voice was slurred, the words coming out in a dreamy monotone. "Sure," Shaw said. "Yeah, of course." Shaw turned back to the mattress, where he'd stowed the 2 duffel bags. He unzipped one of the bags and looked inside. "What the—" he said. He stared at the contents, blinking rapidly, not at all sure what was going on. He turned the bag over on the mattress, and what tumbled out made no sense at all. Plastic trash bags, duct tape, dust masks, glow sticks, candles, chemical water purifiers. It was a classic survival kit, the kind the folks from FEMA had lectured his unit to prepare for their families at home. And then it hit him. Eleanor Norton, he thought. That fucking bitch. She did this. She beat me. How the fuck did that happen? How did that fucking happen? He turned to Anthony, a stack of napkins in his hand, and had no idea what to say. Anthony, Anthony held out his hand. I want to hold it, he said. Shaw looked down at the napkins. Anthony, this... But then he understood, and he tore the band that held the napkins together, and he stuffed the loose napkins into Anthony's groping hand. He closed Anthony's fingers around the paper. You got it? Yeah, Anthony said. There was a dreamy sort of distance in his voice, and in his eyes. It's nice, he said. God, it's nice. I never thought I'd hold so much. I never thought... He trailed off. Shaw watched him carefully, studying his eyes, the tremor in his lips. "Anthony?"
"Dad, I wanted to say... I wanted to..."
He raised his hand slowly, and the paper napkins tumbled from his fingers and floated down to the water around his hips. Tears were streaming down Shaw's face now.
"I wanted you to know that I love...
Anthony trailed off again, as though he were deep in thought, considering exactly the right way to say what was weighing on his mind. And while he was lost in thought, the change happened. The last spark of intelligence left his eyes. The essence of who he was, who he had been, was gone. His left arm came up slowly. His mouth fell open, and a moan rose up from his throat. Shaw watched the change, weeping, then raised his rifle. "I love you too, Anthony. God help me, I love you with all my heart." And then he fired. The bullet snapped Anthony's head back, and he sagged down into the water. Shaw crossed the room quickly and scooped Anthony up in his arms. He pulled him back over to the mattress and threw his arms around him and rocked him gently. "I love you," he said, kissing the top of Anthony's head. "I love you, Anthony." Shaw threw back his head and yelled at the top of his lungs. There was so much inside him, so much rage and love and fear and bitter, bitter loss, and it came out of him in a flood he couldn't have controlled for all the world. His high, lonely cry was met by renewed moaning from out in the hallway. The door burst open, the top half coming loose from the hinges and falling over the top of the bed frame. Shaw was ready for them. As they scrambled over the top of the bed frame, he was waiting with the M16 trained on the doorway.
"Come on, you bastards!"
He started to fire, and he didn't stop shooting, not until they pulled him down into screaming oblivion. Chapter 23. It was a little after 3 a.m. when Eleanor and Jim and Madison slipped away from the apartment building and began their solitary trek toward the city walls. In the distance they could hear gunfire and helicopters and indistinct sounds that might have been screams. And closer, coming from all around them, the moans of the infected. They were survivors, too. Not many, but a few. They walked silently on, bound for God knew where. They didn't hail the Nortons, and the Nortons didn't wave or call out to them. It was as if they all existed under glass bell jars, visible to each other, but worlds and worlds apart. It made Eleanor feel sad and small and very tired. To the south, the sky was a hazy orange. The oil refineries were still burning, and the breeze carried the smell of ash and the sea. And under that, the deep, worn-in stench of chemicals and death. If this didn't qualify as hell, Eleanor wasn't sure what would. "We have to find a boat," Jim said. "I don't think I can walk much farther." Eleanor, her hair in damp clumps around her face, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, knew exactly how he felt. She wasn't far from falling over herself. Only Madison seemed to have any stomach left for a long walk. There was a sort of electric buzz around her. The girl couldn't stand still. Her eyes darted everywhere. She flinched at the slightest sound. Eleanor watched her and knew the poor thing was in for a crash when the adrenaline wore off. She just hoped it wouldn't happen too soon. "I guess," Eleanor said, "we head toward the wall and hope that we can find something. A lot of boats got left there." "How far you suppose it is?" She shrugged. "An hour's walk, maybe? I don't know." His shoulders sagged visibly. In the faint starlight he looked 10 years younger, his hair darker, his chin more defined. And that was it, she realized. He did look younger. The exhaustion, the resignation, had given him a boy's look, and yet one that seemed to hold the world at arm's length. She wondered if her own expression was equally as youthful. "No such luck, sister," she thought. "It doesn't happen for women that way. The men get younger looking. The women just get exhausted. You probably look exactly like you feel, like you've been run over by a truck." They trudged on. In the distance, Eleanor could see a street lined with the ruins of shops. Beyond that was the Beltway. Even from this far out she could tell that great lengths of it had collapsed and fallen into the water. Around them, the neighborhood had become a nightmare of burned buildings. Whole blocks seemed to have caught fire. In places, nothing remained but a few blackened poles sticking up from the water. Burned debris floated past them. "Did those helicopters do all this?" Madison asked. "I think so." "Why?" "To push people back from the fence, I would imagine. My guess is they're going to put up some kind of wall around the city, at least for the time being." "But what about all the people?" Madison asked. "What about the ones who aren't infected?" Eleanor sighed. "I suppose they'll be locked in with the zombies," she said. "Oh, my God," Madison said, cupping a hand over her mouth. Isn't that against the law or something? How can they do that?" "These are desperate times," Eleanor said. "People do desperate things." Madison didn't respond to that. At first, Eleanor thought it was another of Madison's angst-filled teenage moments, where everything about the world of adults seems stupid and unkind. But then she realized that Madison was crying. "Hey," she said, and put an arm around her. "Hey, you're okay." "They're going to lock us in here," Madison said. Her untidy brown hair had developed a kink above her forehead. Eleanor touched her daughter's hair and tried to smooth it down, but the hair wouldn't cooperate. "We're going to find a way out," Eleanor said. "I promise you. I'm going to take care of you." About a mile farther on they found a boat. Jim noticed it first. They were walking next to a line of shrubs that had somehow escaped the rockets and the fires that had destroyed everything else around here. Eleanor was watching Jim. He had stumbled twice in just a few minutes, and he seemed to be having some trouble breathing. He put a hand to his chest and rubbed there absently, the way a man will do when he's felt a hitch in his heartbeat that he hopes is nothing. "Jim, you holding up okay?" "Yeah, he said. And that was when they heard the sound of tree limbs scraping up against a metal boat hull. They all stopped. "You hear that?" he asked her, suddenly perking up. She nodded. "It sounds like it's coming from over there." Over there was on the other side of the line of shrubs. Jim didn't hesitate. He ducked into the shrubs and disappeared. "Jim, wait!" There was a long pause, and then Jim's voice rose over the shrubs. "It's okay," he said. "You two come on through." Eleanor glanced at Madison, and Madison shrugged. "After you, Mom." "Thanks." Eleanor stepped through the shrubs nervously. The branches were scraggly enough that she was able to hold them out of the way for Madison, revealing a small silver boat with its prow jammed into the canopy of a fallen tree. Eleanor peeked around Jim's shoulder and saw a dead man sitting in the boat. His head had lolled back over his shoulders, but Eleanor could still see the blackened flesh on one side of his face. His clothes, too, were burned. "Ew," Madison said. "What happened to him?" "Must have gotten caught in the explosions over by the Beltway," Jim said. "But how did he get all the way over here?" "Who knows," Jim said. "Maybe he got injured over there and died while he was trying to get away." "Maybe he drifted over here," Eleanor offered. "Yeah, Jim said. "Could be... Here, help me move him off the boat." Eleanor and Jim grabbed the dead man by the back of his shirt and pulled him down into the water. Then they pulled the boat from the tree canopy and gave it a quick once-over. "Looks like it'll work," he said. "Yeah. Madison, you ready?" Madison glanced at the dead man floating face up in the water, swallowed, and then got in. Eleanor followed, then Jim last. He tried to pull the starter cord on the boat's outboard, but he couldn't make it work. "Eleanor, can you—" "Huh?" "My arms," he said lamely. He looked mortified. "I can't. They hurt too bad." She understood then. "Oh, yeah, sure." They switched places, and Eleanor got the motor started and guided them away from the line of shrubs and toward the beltway. They were facing due east, and the coming dawn had lit the sky in tones of pink and gray. Ahead of them, the beltway and the buildings around it looked like London in those grainy old black-and-white movies from the Second World War. Everywhere she looked, Eleanor saw skeletal ruins crumbling into the water. Some were little more than a single wall. Everything had been touched by fire. Gray concrete dust still hung in the air, moving slowly, like smoke on the water. The water was thick with charred bodies. A few, horribly, still moved, and some of them could even raise a blackened hand and moan. The beltway itself was a jumbled mess. Large pieces of concrete jutted up from the water at odd angles, and in the screen of dust they resembled the prows of ships sinking into the ocean. A helicopter flew overhead, very close. Eleanor had already cut the motor a good distance back, rowing them to this point. She didn't want the motor's noise to attract soldiers, or worse, more zombies, and she thought that decision might save them now. The helicopters almost certainly had heat-sensing equipment, so they would pick them up for sure. But if the boat was just drifting, maybe they wouldn't appear any different than the other bodies in the water, and in the derelict boats. After all, most of them had been badly burned. Heat signatures would be everywhere. "Get your head down," she said to Madison. "Everybody stay still." "Mom!" "Shh," Eleanor said. "We're okay. Just stay still. It'll be gone in a second." The helicopter glided slowly overhead. The pilot didn't appear to be looking for anything in particular, just cruising, and Eleanor watched the aircraft glide away until the red taillights were far in the distance. "I think we're okay," she said at last. "No," Jim said. "Eleanor, we can't do it this way. As soon as they realize that we're not a derelict, they'll fire on us. We didn't come all this way to die now." "No," she said. "You're right." "So what do we do?" Eleanor smiled. 24 hours earlier, she would have answered Jim's question with an "I don't know." But now things had changed. She had changed, and she knew exactly what they needed to do. "Hang on," she said. "We're doubling back." The first fingers of daylight were spreading over the flooded ruins when she finally found what she was looking for. "Okay," she said in a whisper. "You do wait for me here." "Eleanor, Hey, it'll be okay. Jim, I can do this." He looked at her then, and the expression on his face was one she didn't quite recognize. "What is it?" "It's you," he said. "You've changed." She started to object, to ask him what that was supposed to mean, but he stopped her. "No," he said. No, it's a good thing. I mean—" "Oh, hell. Eleanor, we've been married 15 years, and I never knew this woman was inside of you. It's like you've blossomed. You're like Superwoman, or Wonder Woman, or whatever the hell she's called, but you have changed. All I'm trying to say is I like it. I like this." She was blushing to the roots of her hair. "I don't really—" she started to say. but trailed off. He leaned forward and kissed her then. "Just be careful, okay? Please?" She nodded. "Jesus," she thought, mentally kicking herself. "Are you crying? Stop being such a girl." Eleanor mopped the tears from her eyes with the back of her hand. Then she handed Jim her backpack. "You two get going," she said. "I love you, Mom," said Madison. "I love you too, baby. Go with your dad, okay? We'll be out of here before you know it." Madison hugged her. Eleanor didn't want to let go, but she knew this had to get done. They were running out of darkness. "Go on," she said, guiding Madison toward Jim. Jim took Madison by the shoulders, and together they climbed out of the boat and swam silently over to a pile of broken concrete not far from a hole in the chain-link fence the military had set up. 2 National Guardsmen were standing sentry duty by the hole. They were sitting in a small white fishing boat, drinking coffee from Starbucks cups, looking tired and bored. From the shelter of a bent-over street sign, Eleanor watched Jim and Madison glide into position, so that they were less than 30 feet from the sentries. "Good," she thought. "Good job, Jim." Then she turned the boat away and paddled a good distance off. Looking back to the east, she faced the spreading dawn. The horizon was lit with red and copper and gold, the flooded landscape below it a tapestry of shadow and murky light. Years later, when she thought back to this time, to leaving Houston, this is how she would remember it. The crumbling walls dappled with red sunlight, the water towers standing like mute giants over the rubble and the burned bodies, the demolished beltway. She was tempted to turn back to the south and get one final look at the rest of the city that had been her home her entire life. But something told her not to, that looking back was somehow the wrong thing to do. It certainly hadn't worked for Lot's wife. It was the second time in as many days she had thought of the story of Lot's wife, and she couldn't help but chuckle now at the idea of a woman turning into a pillar of salt. But while she could laugh at the image, she could not laugh at the sense behind the story. For wasn't there a certain undeniable truth in it? Didn't it tally with Eleanor's own situation just a little? There was nothing behind Eleanor but the ghost of a city, the end of one life and the beginning of another, but much more uncertain life. And maybe that was why Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt. Maybe she couldn't reconcile the palaces of her memory with the ruins of her reality. Maybe. But there was no more time for idle thoughts and stories. She scanned the ruins to the east, looking for a target. There were burnt corpses all around her. She pulled one of them into the boat and positioned it next to her. "You ready?" she said to the dead body. "Well, good. At least one of us is." And then she twisted the throttle all the way open, turning the little boat on a collision course with the military. She pulled the rifle's sling over her shoulder and threw one leg over the gunwale. "See you around," she said. Then she jumped over the side. From his hiding place, Jim watched the little boat accelerate through a debris field of wrecked trucks and garbage and toppled street signs. There was a body hunched over the motor. He projected the line of the boat's course and figured it would hit about 600 yards north of their position. That is, if the military didn't blow it out of the water long before that. In fact, he was already seeing movement around the quarantine wall. A pair of helicopters was sprinting that way, their noses dipped toward the water in an attitude that made them look fiercely determined. Boats were scrambling outside the wall as well. He could see 4 of them powering up, turning that way. Then he looked back at the hole. The 2 sentries were still sitting in their boat, drinking their coffee, their weapons leaning against their seats. Only now they were craning their necks toward the little boat, watching it speed to its imminent destruction. Jim wished he could make some sense out of the voices coming from their radios, but it just sounded like a garbled mess to him. the same as Eleanor's police radio had back when she was still a patrol officer. They didn't seem too concerned, though.
Daddy?
Madison was looking at him. Poor thing is terrified, he thought. Well, that makes two of us. It's okay, he said. Your mother's going to be along here any second.
Are you sure this is going to work?
No, he wanted to say. Instead, he smiled and squeezed Madison to him. Your mother knows what she's doing, he said. And to himself he added, Please let that be true. Eleanor rose slowly from the water. She was behind a pile of concrete beams, watching the National Guardsmen through a gap in the rubble. Definitely weekend soldiers, she thought. The two men were in their mid-30s, both a little overweight, both more interested in complaining about their assignment than in watching their surroundings. And that was just as well. She had swum hard and fast to get here before the little motorboat reached the wall. If these two had managed to keep their heads out of their asses, they would have surely heard her coming. Oh, well, she thought, you snooze, you lose. She stepped around the cement pile with her weapon up and ready. Hey, hey! One of the men said. Their coffee cups went flying as the two men reached clumsily for their weapons. Don't do it, guys, Eleanor said. Hands where I can see them. From somewhere off to their right, Eleanor heard the sound of guns firing, and she figured the little boat and its corpse captain had just been reduced to floating splinters. She didn't break her concentration, though. Fellas, I don't want to kill you. Nobody else needs to die. Just keep those hands up where I can see them. Go on now, that's it. Keep 'em up. Who the fuck are you? One of them said. The name plate on his uniform said Gladry. Does it really matter, Mr. Gladry? You and Mr. Unwin there need to step out of the boat and onto the roof of that pickup there. Gladry just stared at her. Move, she said. Fuck you, lady, we're not going anywhere. Eleanor swallowed, flexed her finger on the trigger. Jesus, she didn't want to do this. She did not want to kill these guys. But then, from beside her, she heard Jim's voice. You heard the lady, he said. You boys need to move it. Eleanor glanced at him. She was going to tell him he was crazy, order him back behind cover, remind him she had this under control. But all that changed when she saw him. He was standing there, water dripping off him, her pistol in his hands, and pointed at the two National Guardsmen. And then he winked at her. The bastard actually winked at her. She would have laughed if she weren't so damn terrified. But evidently it was enough for the one named Unwin, because he stepped over the side and onto the roof of the pickup next to their boat. Gladry tried to reach for his radio, which was resting inside a cup holder next to the driver's seat, but Eleanor stopped him. No, she said sharply. Leave the radios. Leave the weapons. The soldier nodded, raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, and followed Unwin onto the pickup. You can't do this, Gladry said to Eleanor. Without taking her weapon off them, Eleanor gave a hand sign for Jim and Madison to climb into the boat the soldiers had just left. The two soldiers watched them get on board. Their faces were taut with suppressed tension. A vein in Gladry's forehead seemed to pulse. You're wrong about that, Gladry. I'm getting my family out of here, and I can, and I will, do anything to make that happen. Then Jim lowered his hand toward her, and Eleanor took it, and he swung her up into the boat. She picked up their radios and inspected the display. It was a Motorola, same as the one the HPD used, but with a slightly different channel system. She tossed both radios into the water. Hey! Gladry said. Jim looked at the ripples where the radio had just sunk below the surface, and then to Eleanor. They can track those, she said. She motioned to the pistol in Jim's hand. Cover them for a second. She ejected the magazines from each of the soldiers' rifles and cleared the chambers. Then she tossed the rifles into the flooded cab of the pickup the two men were standing on. What did you do that for? Unwin said. "Just because I want my family to live doesn't mean I want you to die," Eleanor answered. She tossed their magazines into the flooded bed of the truck. "You can get those back once we're out of sight. Deal?"
"Fuck you!"
Gladry said. His face was turning beet red now. "I'll take that as a yes." She turned to Jim and pointed at a line of buildings off to the left. "Take us out slowly, around that block over there. Don't go too fast. I don't want to attract any attention." "Okay," Jim said, and they moved out. They were able to follow Highway 290 for about 20 minutes before the water got too shallow for the boat. After that, they ditched it and started walking. It didn't take long before they started hearing the sounds of cars in the distance. "Eleanor," Jim said, "do you think we can stop soon? I don't think I can walk anymore." It was the heat and the humidity. It was getting to her, too. "Yeah, I guess," she said. "Cypress is just up the road a ways. Maybe we can find a truck stop and get something to eat." He just shook his head. "What?" she asked. "I don't have my wallet with me. Everything was lost when I lost my backpack. Do you have yours and your backpack there?" "No," she said. "Yeah, well, we're pretty much screwed then." He kicked at a pebble on the ground. "Do you at least have any water?" "No." "Nothing? No juice boxes? Nothing?" "I dumped all that stuff," she said. "You dumped it?" She nodded. He looked at her then. "What is it? Why are you smiling? If you dumped our supplies, what's in there?" She took her backpack off and laid it at his feet. "Open it," she said. A baffled grin was starting to appear at the corners of his mouth. "What are you up to?" he said, as he unzipped the pack. Then he looked inside, and the smile slid off his face. He reached in and pulled out a cellophane-wrapped brick of $100 bills. "What the—" he said. There's like 40 of these things in here." "I know," she said. She tried to hold in the giggles, but couldn't quite manage it. "That's like— How much is this?" he said, stammering. She shrugged. "I think it's about $7 million. Eleanor glanced at Madison. The girl's eyes were wide open and bright. $7 million, Jim said. His voice was hushed, reverent. "About that," Eleanor said. "What do you think? You're the insurance man in this family. Is that enough for us to start our lives over?" He threw the brick of money into the backpack, and as he sat there on the side of the road, he began to laugh. It was the deep, glorious sound of unfettered joy, the kind of laughter she hadn't heard from him in years. The next instant, Madison joined him, and to Eleanor, their laughter sounded like freedom. This concludes Flesh Eaters.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.